So the idea now is I'll just ask a couple of questions, and maybe the audience here, you can start thinking of some more, and we'll have a Q&A, and then we can break up and have a couple of small group discussions. That's the basic idea. So maybe I'll start with Katya. So I picked up on you made a comment that there are quite some significant differences between this area we're in toxicology and the medical field, and that would present different challenges. What I mean, when I think of it in terms of standards and disagreements we have and different factions of kinds of science, I mean, it looks quite challenging to get acceptance of this evidence-based approach. How do you think we're going to be as successful as Cochrane was in the medical area?
Yeah, that's the aspiration, that it becomes embraced by everybody as a standard. And as I said, we sort of deal with old school toxicologists on a daily basis, and we always hear the pushback that how do you dare not include my study in something or other, because I've done it for 45 years. But apparently, if you talk to some people who were involved in Cochrane years back, this was the pushback from clinicians. They're not any less arrogant than toxicologists, right? No expert likes to be told what to do and how, especially if you don't actually, like many systematic reviewers are statisticians and they don't actually do the actual wet work themselves. They just look at the numbers and do statistics. And so how do we become successful? I think it's really bringing together different stakeholders and agreeing between many organizations, both regulatory agencies and industry and academics, on methods on how to do this. I think everybody agrees that we have a reproducibility crisis in biology across the board, and that's one of the ways that it could be addressed, I think.
And we have a lot more knowledge on drugs than we have on many other kinds of chemicals. So I'd like to ask Kris, how do you think you're going to be able to cope with the fact that in many of your situations you've got a lot less data than we have in the drug case kind of situation, and are there ways for both fields to help each other out, or how do we get more evidence for the chemical assessment that you need?
Well, I come from Irish, so some of we tend to deal with the data-rich chemicals. No, but I'm teasing. So I would say less studies, fewer studies, but just make them better. No, I think that sort of the systematic review, I think that the methods are most developed for sort of, quote, the traditional evidence, the human, the animal bioassay, and even in the animal bioassay range, it's more method development. So I think when I think about what Katya's trying to do, it's really a lot of, there aren't great systematic review methods. And that's why what she's doing is so impactful. I think in the context of, how would you structure systematic review aimed sort of at a data poor space, then that comes the structured framework and thinking about your confidence. And so you can imagine that if you're dealing with modeled evidence and you don't have an indication of how predictive it is or how applicable it is, so that might be a factor that you could probably articulate as decreasing your confidence in your conclusions. So I think there are ways that you can deal with sort of the data poor scenarios in systematic review, but probably not in a way that in most cases is going to lead you to sort of say this is high quality evidence in toto.
You want to say maybe a few words on how you see the challenge ahead of us in terms of getting acceptance by the regulatory decision-making process? Are you optimistic that we're going to achieve acceptance of this new kind of methodology? How are we going to go about that so we impact regulatory affairs using this new regulatory science?
Well, I think that's the trend, right? That's the trend. We're probably not going to be doing as many animal bioassays in the future. So I think, there are certainly assessments within EPA, for example. They have a product line, PPRTVs, that sort of deals with more of these data poor. So you have to do assessments on the best available evidence. And sometimes that best available evidence is more of sort of the alternative or modeled evidence. And, again, I think that you can do the assessment. I think it should be appropriately characterized in terms of your confidence in it. But that's where there's going to be some tension in terms of users who have to sort of face sort of the legislative climate to really stand up behind those kind of assessments.
And I'm just wondering, so Katya, now you're doing this intense case. How do you deal with areas of knowledge where there's clear conflicting evidence, or where we really do have gaps in the available evidence? How do we address that uncertainty in the case study work?
Well, there is actually a systematic tool that that one of the projects that we're starting is in systematic maps. It actually does deal with that. So it's something that you do before the systematic review. You actually identify what evidence you have and where are the knowledge gaps, right? So another way to deal with this is to actually do the answer the question and go through the process, and then you identify what you're missing, right? But it takes time. It takes time, and as Kris showed, it's very, very labor intensive.
What about, maybe I'll leave it with you, we can ask Kris too. What about areas of assessment where we really don't understand the mechanisms? For example, let's take nanotechnology. We're really unclear what actually happens to initiate the adverse outcome pathway. Can it be helpful there too?
Yes, I think so, because we are again. This is where this heterogeneity of the literature maybe is an advantage in cases like this. So again, I think systematic map approach could be really powerful here. If we found a way, if we queried the literature with a specific question. Again, the beauty of this approach is that it's a very specific question. It's PICO question, right? Everything is framed in this. And it's like you ask what population you're looking at, what outcomes you're looking at, for example, liver or heart or whatever. And you ask that question and you get the information from the literature and make sort of an inventory of different endpoints and outcomes that people looked at. And from there, you can actually probably start seeing something more than from one single study, because you're looking at the body of literature. And also to answer your previous question about how do you learn from, how do you apply this to data rich and data poor compounds and whatnot? It's actually you can learn from each other. So we're using these fields could learn from each other. We're using this exercise or test method assessment on pharmaceuticals because they are data rich, but they're only data rich because they've been on the market and there's a lot of published literature. The compounds that are actually going through the pipeline and drug candidates, they're not data rich, so there's no reason to do systematic review on them, maybe on some structural analogs and whatnot, but everything is proprietary until it gets to market. So that's an area where it's not going to be useful. So systematic review is not an answer for everything, but we're using this case to actually develop the hopefully predictive model, so you have confidence in some of these additional assays that hopefully fill the gaps so that we have fewer adverse reactions. And so in the context of pharmaceuticals, you would use it, you would use the results of the systematic review, so to speak, right?
Mm-hmm. I remember also, Kris, you mentioned in your talk an important point that it would be very valuable if we could get people in the community agreeing to using a common terminology when they're annotating their data or their summary results. But we know from our experience so far in this world, at least, that people tend not to do this and tend to report their results in many different ways. So how do we actually make that happen operationally? How do we motivate and translate that into the community changing their behavior? Are you optimistic, or how should we go about it?
I'm partially optimistic. So at least in the Hawk space, I know that, so this is a fairly new software application, and I think it's really matured a lot in the past couple of years. And so I am aware of interest, for example, from ATSDR, from some sort of non-government entities interested, who are doing systematic review, interested in using Hawk. So obviously, if the community using this particular tool grows, then there's an opportunity to, at least within that space, try to sort of share the lessons learned about terminology. I think in terms of crosswalking with other databases, I'm hoping that at least at some of the higher levels, organ system level, that even if the content is, hepatic, liver, we could probably crosswalk those, So I think more of a synonym-based approach to look for opportunities there. But when you're talking about sort of the very granular level, the endpoint name, and it being captured in this specific way, then no, I don't think that there's a lot of room for optimism on existing databases that weren't developed with that in mind.